The strange thing about kindness is that sometimes the smallest favor can return as the most powerful miracle. The rain had begun just after sunset, the kind that fell steadily over downtown Chicago, turning the pavement into mirrors of yellow streetlights and passing headlights. Sophie Bennett pulled her thin denim jacket tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out of the diner where she had just finished her late shift. The smell of fried onions and coffee still clung to her clothes, and her feet ached after standing for nearly 12 hours. In her small purse sat exactly $25, the last money she had until the next paycheck, which was still days away. As she walked toward the subway entrance, she noticed a man standing beneath a flickering bus stop light across the street. His hair was damp from the rain, his shirt clinging to his shoulders, and he kept glancing at the empty road with quiet frustration. For a moment, Sophie tried to ignore him. Chicago was full of strangers with problems, and she had more than enough of her own. But something in the man's expression stopped her. It was not desperation or anger. It was embarrassment, the quiet kind that comes from needing help, but not wanting to ask for it. She slowed her steps. The man finally spoke in a low voice that nearly disappeared under the sound of rain. He explained that his phone battery had died. His wallet had been lost earlier that evening, and every taxi had passed him by. He said he only needed a ride across the city and promised he would somehow repay the favor. Sophie looked down at her purse, knowing exactly what sat inside. $25. Her bus ride home cost only a few dollars, but that money was also meant for groceries the next day. For a moment, she felt the familiar weight of survival pressing against her chest. Then she exhaled slowly, pulled out her phone, and opened a ride application. Within seconds, she ordered a car for the stranger, using the last of her balance. The headlights of the car soon appeared through the rain, rolling to a stop beside them. The man looked stunned when she told him the ride was already paid for. He asked why she would do that for someone she had never met. Sophie simply shrugged with a tired smile and said that everyone needs help sometimes. The car door closed, the vehicle disappeared into the rain, and Sophie stood alone under the dim bus stop light, wondering if she had just made the most foolish decision of her week. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Sophie did not know that the quiet stranger she had helped that rainy night was not simply another unlucky traveler. Across the city, inside the moving car, the man leaned back in the seat and stared at the glowing receipt on the driver's screen that confirmed the ride had already been paid in full. His name was Alexander Cole, and he was the founder and chief executive officer of one of the largest transportation technology companies in the country. And for reasons he could not yet explain, the image of the tired waitress who had spent her last $25 on a stranger had already begun to change the course of his life. The bus ride home that night felt longer than usual, even though the distance had not changed. Sophie Bennett sat near the back of the nearly empty city bus, watching rain slide down the windows like thin silver threads. The streetlights of Chicago drifted past in blurred reflections, stretching across the glass and disappearing into the dark. Her shoes were still damp from walking through puddles, and the ache in her feet pulsed with every small movement of the bus. In her purse, there was now almost nothing left. The $25 she had planned to stretch through the week had vanished into a ride for a stranger whose name she did not even know. For a moment, she wondered what kind of person spent her last bit of money on someone she might never see again. The question lingered in her mind as the bus rolled through quiet streets toward the small neighborhood, where she rented a single narrow room above an aging grocery store. When Sophie stepped off the bus, the rain had softened to a mist that floated through the yellow glow of the street lamps. She walked the short distance to the stairwell beside the store and climbed the creaking wooden steps that led to her room. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and cooking oil from the restaurant downstairs. Inside her room, there was little more than a small bed, a folding table, and a second-hand lamp that flickered whenever the wind shook the window frame. Sophie dropped her purse onto the table and removed her shoes with a quiet sigh. Her stomach growled softly, reminding her that she had skipped dinner during her shift to save money. Full. Alexander had built an entire transportation empire around digital platforms and data systems. Yet he could not remember the last time a stranger had offered him something without knowing exactly who he was. In the world he usually lived in, every conversation carried an agenda, and every handshake had a calculation. But the young waitress at the bus stop had looked at him as if he were simply another tired traveler in need of help. He replayed the moment in his mind again. Her quiet shrug, her tired smile. Everyone needs help sometimes. The words echoed more strongly than he expected. When the car stopped in front of the tower entrance, the driver stepped out to open the door. Alexander remained seated for another moment, staring once more at the ride receipt glowing on the screen. $25. For Sophie Bennett, it had been the last money she had. For him, it was less than the cost of a cup of coffee in the executive lounge upstairs. Yet somehow that small act had unsettled him more than any business crisis in recent memory. As he finally stepped out of the car and looked up at the tall building that carried his company name across its upper floors, Alexander realized something unusual had begun to form in his thoughts. He wanted to find the girl who had helped him in the rain, not to repay the money. Something deeper than that had already taken root. And for the first time in many years, the most powerful transportation executive in the city was thinking less about profit and more about a single unexpected moment of kindness on a quiet Chicago street. Morning arrived slowly over Chicago, the gray clouds still hanging low above the city skyline, as if the rain from the night before had never truly left. Sophie Bennett woke to the soft rattling of the old window beside her bed. For a moment she remained still beneath the thin blanket, listening to the distant rumble of early traffic and the faint sound of a delivery truck backing into the alley below. Her alarm had not yet gone off, but habit had trained her body to wake early. Rent, bills, and responsibility had a way of doing that to people. She pushed herself upright and glanced toward the small table where her purse and sketchbook rested. The memory of the previous night returned quickly. The stranger at the bus stop. The ride she had paid for. The $25 that had disappeared from her already fragile budget. Sophie swung her feet onto the cold floor and stretched slowly, trying to shake away the worry that always followed her mornings. She dressed in the same faded jeans and pale blue shirt she wore to the diner, tying her hair into a simple ponytail before checking the time on her phone. A message notification waited on the screen from the diner manager. Her stomach tightened slightly before she even opened it. Experience had taught her that early messages from management rarely carried good news. The text was short and direct. Due to slower business this week, several shifts have been reduced. Sophie stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the familiar quiet pressure settle on her chest. Reduced shifts meant fewer hours. Fewer hours meant less money. And less money meant the delicate balance she lived on every month was about to become even more difficult. She exhaled slowly and set the phone down. Complaining would not change anything. It never had. Instead, she walked to the small sink in the corner of the room, splashed cold water on her face, and forced herself to focus on the day ahead. By mid-morning, the diner had begun to fill with its usual rhythm of conversation and clinking dishes. The place sat on a busy corner not far from the river, attracting office workers, construction crews, and college students looking for cheap coffee and hot breakfasts. Sophie moved quickly between tables carrying plates of eggs, toast, and pancakes while the smell of fresh bacon drifted through the air. She had learned how to keep a calm smile on her face even when exhaustion pressed at the edges of her thoughts. A customer complained about cold coffee. Another requested extra syrup. A third asked for the check twice before she had finished delivering the food. It was an ordinary morning in a job that rarely changed. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind, the image of the stranger from the bus stop lingered. She wondered briefly if he had made it safely to wherever he had been going. She wondered if he had eventually found his wallet or charged his phone. Mostly she wondered if he had realized how much that small ride had cost her. But the thought faded quickly as the lunch rush arrived and the diner filled with the louder sounds of the city. Across town, inside the polished glass headquarters of Coal Transit Group, the atmosphere was very different. The upper floors of the building overlooked the Chicago River, offering a sweeping view of the skyline that most residents only saw in photographs. Alexander Cole stood near the wide window of his office, holding a tablet in one hand while the early sunlight reflected off the water below. Normally, his mornings began with financial reports, operational updates, and meetings with senior executives. Today, his attention drifted again to something far simpler. On the screen in front of him was the digital receipt from the previous night. The record showed a ride request placed through the company application, fully paid before the vehicle had even arrived. The name attached to the account was Sophie Bennett. Alexander studied the name as if repeating it might reveal more about the person behind it. He had built a company that tracked millions of rides every week, analyzing patterns, demand, and efficiency across cities. Yet this single ride felt strangely different. It was not the transaction that stayed in his mind. It was the decision behind it. A waitress who could barely afford her own expenses had spent her last $25 on a stranger standing in the rain. In the business world Alexander moved through every day, generosity rarely appeared without expectation. But this had been something else entirely. He turned away from the window and walked toward his desk, the thought forming more clearly with each step. Somewhere in this vast city was the young woman who had offered help without hesitation. And for reasons he could not quite explain yet, Alexander Cole had already decided that he needed to find her. Later that afternoon, the rhythm of the diner slowed as the lunch crowd faded back into the streets of Chicago. The air inside the restaurant still carried the warm scent of grilled sandwiches and coffee, but the noise had softened into scattered conversations and the occasional clink of dishes. Sophie Bennett wiped down a table near the window while watching gray clouds drift slowly across the sky outside. The day had passed in the same steady routine that filled most of her weeks. Orders, plates, coffee refills, and quiet smiles for strangers she would never see again. It was not a glamorous life, but it was honest work, and for Sophie that had always been enough. Yet every now and then her thoughts wandered back to the previous night. She remembered the way the rain had fallen under the dim bus stoplight and the look of surprise on the stranger's face when she told him the ride was already paid for. She had helped many people in small ways over the years, but something about that moment had felt different. Not dramatic or life-changing, just quietly human. After finishing the table, she carried a stack of dishes toward the kitchen, where the cook was already preparing the afternoon batch of soup. The diner owner, a middle-aged man named Frank, stood near the counter reviewing a small clipboard with the tired expression of someone constantly balancing numbers that never seemed to cooperate. When Sophie approached, he glanced up with a sympathetic look. Business had been slower lately, and everyone working there knew it. Frank cleared his throat before speaking in a careful voice. He explained that the diner would need to shorten shifts again during the coming days. He apologized, but there simply were not enough customers to keep everyone scheduled the same number of hours. Sophie listened quietly, nodding as he spoke. The news did not surprise her. She had already seen the message that morning. Even so, hearing it out loud made the reality settle deeper in her thoughts. Fewer hours meant less money. Less money meant the thin margin she lived on each month was becoming even thinner. She forced a small, reassuring smile and told Frank that she understood. After all, none of this was really his fault. Outside the diner, the wind picked up slightly, pushing loose leaves along the sidewalk as evening approached. When her shift finally ended, Sophie stepped outside with her purse over her shoulder and her sketchbook tucked carefully under one arm. The air had cooled since morning, carrying the faint smell of the river drifting through the city streets. Instead of heading directly home, she walked several blocks toward a small public park she often visited when she needed quiet. The park overlooked a stretch of the Chicago River where boats moved slowly beneath the steel bridges that connected the busy downtown streets. Sophie sat on a wooden bench facing the water and opened her sketchbook once again. The drawing from a night before still filled the page. A bus stop light glowing through rain and the outline of a stranger waiting beneath it. She traced the edge of the drawing lightly with her finger, almost as if trying to remember more about the moment. But the truth was she knew very little about the man she had helped. His name, where he lived, where he worked. All of it remained a mystery that would probably disappear with time. Across the city, in the tall glass tower of Coal Transit Group, the afternoon meeting had just ended. Several executives filed out of the conference room, discussing transportation routes and quarterly projections, their voices fading into the quiet hallway. Alexander Cole remained seated at the long polished table for a moment after everyone else had left. The documents in front of him described complex strategies for expanding the company's services across several major cities. Yet his attention drifted elsewhere again. He picked up his tablet and opened the ride record from the previous night once more. Sophie Bennett. The name had stayed with him all day. Most people who interacted with his company saw only an application on their phone and a driver arriving at the curb. They never imagined the person responsible for the system behind it all. But Alexander had spent years studying the patterns of human behavior within those millions of rides. Efficiency, pricing, demand, supply. Everything could be measured and predicted with enough data. Everything except kindness. The more he thought about it, the more unusual the moment felt. A young waitress who barely had enough money for herself had chosen to help a stranger standing in the rain without hesitation. That kind of decision could not be explained by algorithms or business models. It came from something deeper. Alexander stood from the table and walked slowly toward the wide window at the end of the room. The Chicago skyline stretched across the horizon as evening sunlight reflected off the river below. Somewhere within that vast city was the woman who had quietly reminded him that generosity still existed beyond the world of boardrooms and financial reports. And as he watched the lights begin to appear across the buildings, Alexander realized his curiosity had already turned into determination. He was not going to forget the girl from the bus stop. He was going to find her. The following morning arrived with a pale gray sky stretching above Chicago, the kind of quiet morning that made the city feel slower for a few brief hours before the noise returned. Sophie Bennett walked toward the diner with her sketchbook tucked inside her bag and her hands buried deep in the pockets of her denim jacket. The air carried the faint chill of approaching autumn, and the sidewalks were already filling with commuters heading toward offices and train stations. Sophie moved through the crowd unnoticed, just another face among thousands of people trying to make it through another ordinary day. Inside the diner, the coffee machines were already humming, and the early breakfast customers had begun to take their seats near the windows. Sophie tied on her apron and began her routine without hesitation, pouring coffee, delivering plates, and greeting each customer with the same warm patience she always carried. Yet even while she worked, a quiet worry lingered in the back of her thoughts. Her reduced shifts meant the coming weeks would be difficult. Rent was due soon, and the small envelope where she kept her savings was nearly empty. She reminded herself that she had survived worse moments before. Life had taught her resilience early, and she had learned to move forward even when the path ahead looked uncertain. Across the city, the headquarters of Coal Transit Group was already alive with activity. The tall glass building reflected the rising sunlight as employees moved quickly through the lobby carrying laptops, reports, and cups of coffee. On the top floor, Alexander Cole stepped into his office with the steady composure of someone used to running an empire that never stopped moving. His assistant, Daniel Harper, followed him with a tablet filled with the morning schedule. Meetings with investors, transportation regulators, and senior managers lined the entire day. Normally, Alexander moved through this schedule with precise focus. Today, however, one small detail had not left his thoughts since the previous night. Sophie Bennett. As Daniel began listing the agenda for the morning, Alexander interrupted him with an unusual request. He asked Daniel to pull up the ride record from the company system that matched the account named Sophie Bennett. Daniel paused briefly, clearly surprised that the chief executive officer was interested in a single customer record among millions. Still, he nodded and began working through the secure database on his tablet. Within a few moments, the system displayed the information connected to the ride that had been requested 2 nights earlier during the rainstorm. The account showed a payment of $25 for a ride across the city. It also displayed a basic profile with a name, an electronic mail address, and a general location linked to the device used to request a ride. Daniel glanced up carefully before asking if there had been a service issue with the trip. Alexander shook his head slowly. There had been no complaint, no technical error, no customer dispute. Instead, he explained in calm words that the ride had been paid for by someone who could barely afford it. Daniel listened with growing curiosity as Alexander described the encounter at the bus stop. A young waitress, standing in the rain, had used her last money to help a stranger she did not know. In the business world of transportation technology, most interactions between customers and companies were measured in efficiency and speed. Rarely did they involve acts of personal generosity. Daniel finally leaned back in his chair, understanding why the moment had stayed in his employer's mind. Alexander then gave a simple instruction that carried unusual weight. He asked Daniel to find out where Sophie Bennett worked. Not to contact her yet. Not to reveal anything about the company. He simply wanted to know more about the person who had made that decision in the rain. Daniel agreed and began searching through the information connected to the ride account and public records available through standard databases. The results appeared faster than expected. Within a few minutes, he located a possible match. Sophie Bennett worked at a small diner not far from the river, a place that served breakfast and lunch to office workers in the downtown area. Alexander studied the information silently. Somewhere in that busy neighborhood, the young woman was probably moving between tables, carrying coffee and plates of food, without the slightest idea that the stranger she had helped was one of the most influential transportation executives in the country. Alexander finally set the tablet down and looked toward the wide window overlooking the Chicago River. The sunlight reflected brightly across the water as boats moved slowly beneath the bridges. He knew that approaching Sophie Bennett directly as the head of a billion-dollar company might frighten or confuse her. People often behave differently when they realized who he was. But Alexander did not want gratitude or admiration. What he wanted was to understand the kind of person who would spend her last $25 to help someone she had never met. And as the city continued moving below his office window, Alexander Cole quietly decided that very soon he would walk into that small diner and meet Sophie Bennett again, this time under very different circumstances. The next afternoon, the sky above Chicago was clear for the first time in several days, sunlight reflecting off the glass buildings along the river as traffic flowed steadily through the downtown streets. Inside the small diner where Sophie Bennett worked, the lunch hour had just begun, the room filled with the familiar sounds of conversation, clinking dishes, and the low hum of the coffee machines behind the counter. Sophie moved quickly between tables carrying plates of sandwiches and bowls of soup, while greeting customers with the calm, friendly smile she had learned to wear through long shifts. For her, the diner was a place of constant motion where 1 hour blended into the next. She rarely had time to pause and think about anything beyond the next order or the next refill of coffee. That afternoon felt no different until the small bell above the entrance door chimed softly and a man stepped inside. Alexander Cole paused just inside the doorway for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust to the warm light of the diner after the brightness of the street outside. He had chosen simple clothes that would not attract attention, a dark jacket and a plain shirt that made him look like any other professional stopping in for a late lunch. Even so, his posture carried the quiet confidence of someone used to leading boardrooms and negotiating deals worth millions of dollars. From across the room, Sophie glanced toward the entrance, as she always did whenever a new customer arrived. At first, she saw only another man looking for a seat, but as he stepped forward, her memory stirred faintly. Something about his face felt familiar. The shape of his expression, the calm way he scanned the room. For a brief second, she wondered where she might have seen him before. But the thought slipped away as another customer called her name from across the counter. Alexander chose a small table near the window where sunlight spilled across the wooden surface. From there, he could observe the quiet rhythm of the diner without drawing attention to himself. He watched Sophie as she moved between tables, balancing trays and speaking kindly to customers who barely looked up from their meals. There is nothing dramatic about her behavior, nothing that suggested she had done anything extraordinary 2 nights earlier. She simply worked with steady patience, treating every person in the room with the same quiet respect. After several minutes, Sophie approached his table carrying a pot of fresh coffee. As she reached for the cup in front of him, their eyes met clearly for the first time. Recognition flashed across her face almost immediately. The stranger from the bus stop. The man she had helped in the rain. For a moment, she simply stared, surprised that he had somehow appeared here in the middle of her ordinary workday. Then she laughed softly in disbelief. She told him she had not expected to see him again, especially not in the diner where she worked. Alexander smiled warmly, equally aware of the unusual coincidence from her perspective. He explained that he had been able to track down the ride through the application and wanted to return the favor she had given him that night. Sophie shook her head gently while pouring coffee into his cup. She said there had been no favor that needed returning. She had simply helped someone who needed a ride. In her mind, the moment had already passed and belonged to the quiet collection of small decisions people made every day. Alexander studied her expression carefully as she spoke. There was no sign that she expected gratitude or reward. She truly believed the situation had been ordinary. That realization only strengthened the feeling that had brought him there. He reached into his pocket and placed a small envelope on the table, explaining that it contained the $25 she had spent on the ride. Sophie hesitated before picking it up. She appreciated the gesture, but something about the situation still felt strange to her. Most people would have forgotten the encounter entirely. Few would search through records to find someone they had met for only a few minutes in the Zen. As the conversation continued, the diner noise seemed to fade slightly around them. Sophie sensed that the stranger she had helped was not quite as ordinary as he appeared. Yet she could not have imagined the truth that still remained unspoken between them. Sitting quietly at that small table near the window, Alexander Cole had finally found the young woman whose simple act of kindness had stayed in his thoughts for days. And although Sophie believed this meeting was merely a polite return of $25, the real reason for his visit had only just begun to unfold. For a few moments after Sophie Bennett placed the small envelope on the table, neither of them spoke. The warm afternoon light from the diner window stretched across the wooden surface between them, catching the faint steam rising from the coffee cup. Around them, the lunch crowd continued its ordinary rhythm, customers chatting, plates clinking softly, the sound of the coffee machine humming behind the counter. Yet for Sophie, the moment felt strangely suspended, as if the busy room had faded slightly into the background. She studied the man sitting across from her more carefully now. The rain-soaked stranger she remembered from the bus stop looked different in daylight. His clothes were simple but well-fitted, his posture relaxed yet confident, and his calm eyes seemed to carry the quiet awareness of someone who observed more than he revealed. Sophie finally spoke with a soft laugh that held both curiosity and disbelief. She told him that most people would have simply accepted the ride and disappeared into the city. She asked why he had gone through the trouble of finding her just to return a small amount of money. Alexander Cole rested his hands lightly on the table before answering. His voice remained calm and thoughtful as he explained that it had not been about the money. What stayed in his mind was the decision she made that night. In a city as large and busy as Chicago, most people hurried past strangers without stopping. Yet she had chosen to help someone she knew nothing about. Sophie shrugged modestly, almost embarrassed by the attention. She said it had not been anything special. Sometimes people simply needed help, and if she had the chance to offer it, she tried to do so. Alexander watched her expression closely while she spoke. There was no pride in her voice, no expectation of praise. She truly believed the moment had been ordinary. After a short pause, he decided that continuing to hide the truth would only make the situation more confusing later. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small card, placing it carefully beside the envelope on the table. Sophie glanced down at it absent-mindedly while adjusting the coffee pot in her hand. The card was simple and white with clean lettering across the center. Alexander Cole, founder and chief executive officer of Cole Transit Group. For a moment, Sophie assumed it was some kind of joke. She looked up at him with an amused expression, expecting him to laugh or explain that it belonged to someone else. Instead, she saw only calm sincerity in his face. Her eyes moved back to the card again, reading the words more slowly this time. Coal Transit Group was a name almost everyone in the city recognized. The company operated transportation services across several major states and appeared frequently in business news reports. Sophie felt a quiet wave of confusion pass through her thoughts. She looked toward the diner window, where several dark vehicles had just stopped along the curb. One of the drivers stepped out and glanced briefly toward the entrance before returning to his seat. When she turned back toward the table, Alexander spoke gently, confirming what the card already revealed. He explained that he had built the company many years earlier and that the ride she had ordered during the rainstorm had been through his own transportation platform. Sophie set the coffee pot down slowly as the realization settled over her. The quiet stranger she had helped at the bus stop was not an ordinary traveler at all. He was one of the most powerful business leaders in the city. The absurdity of the situation made her laugh softly in disbelief. She told him that if she had known who he was that night, she probably would have assumed the entire situation was some kind of test. Alexander smiled slightly at her reaction. He explained that he had not intended to test anyone. He had simply been traveling through the city after a meeting when the rain began and his phone battery failed. The rest had happened exactly as she remembered it. Sophie leaned back in the chair for a moment, still trying to process the unexpected truth. In the middle of her ordinary shift at a small diner, she had just discovered that the stranger she helped was the founder of a transportation company worth billions of dollars. Yet what surprised her most was not the wealth or the title. It was the fact that someone with so much power had taken the time to return to a small neighborhood diner just to speak with her again. As the noise of the diner slowly returned to her awareness, Sophie realized that the quiet encounter from 2 nights earlier had just transformed into something far more complicated than she ever could have imagined. For several seconds after the truth settled over the table, Sophie Bennett simply stared at Alexander Cole, unsure whether she should laugh, apologize, or walk away. The small white card still rested beside the envelope containing the $25, and the name printed on it seemed almost unreal against the scratched wood surface of the diner table. Around them, the normal afternoon rhythm continued as if nothing unusual had happened. A group of office workers laughed at a nearby booth. Dishes clinked softly behind the counter, and the cook called out an order from the kitchen. Yet Sophie felt as if the entire room had shifted slightly beneath her feet. She finally exhaled and shook her head slowly, a quiet smile forming despite her confusion. She told Alexander that she had never imagined the stranger she helped on a rainy street would turn out to be one of the most powerful executives in the city. Alexander responded calmly, explaining that titles and wealth often sounded far more impressive on paper than they felt in daily life. At the bus stop that night, he had simply been a man with a dead phone battery, standing in the rain. Sophie studied him again with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. She admitted that if someone had told her the story without proof, she would have assumed it belonged in a movie rather than real life. Alexander laughed softly at that. Then his expression grew thoughtful as he leaned slightly forward in his chair. He explained that finding her had not only been about returning the money. The truth was that her decision that night had stayed in his mind in a way he could not ignore. Sophie listened carefully while holding the coffee pot loosely at her side. Alexander told her that during his years building Coal Transit Group, he had spent most of his time surrounded by negotiations, financial strategies, and competitive decisions. In that world, generosity rarely appeared without some kind of expectation attached. Yet at the bus stop, she had acted without asking who he was or what she might gain from helping him. That kind of decision, he said, was rare enough that he could not simply forget it and move on. Sophie felt a faint warmth rise in her cheeks as she heard his words. She insisted again that the moment had not been extraordinary from her perspective. She had simply done what felt right at the time. Alexander nodded respectfully, acknowledging her modesty, but he did not seem convinced that the act was as ordinary as she believed. After a short pause, he made a suggestion that surprised her even more than the earlier revelation. He explained that Coal Transit Group operated several community programs across the city designed to support transportation access for people who struggled to reach jobs, hospitals, and schools. Recently, the company had been exploring ways to expand those programs with stronger connections to neighborhoods and local workers who understood the needs of everyday residents. Alexander looked directly at Sophie as he spoke and asked if she would consider meeting with him again outside the diner to discuss an opportunity to help with one of those initiatives. Sophie blinked in surprise, unsure she had heard him correctly. She reminded him that she was only a waitress who had never worked in a large company or managed any community programs. Alexander responded that her job title was not what interested him. What mattered was the character she had shown when no one was watching. He believed that people who made decisions based on kindness rather than advantage often understood communities better than many professionals with impressive resumes. Sophie hesitated, glancing briefly toward the counter where the diner owner was speaking with another employee. The idea of stepping into a world connected to a billion-dollar company felt overwhelming and almost impossible to imagine. Yet there was something sincere in Alexander's voice that made the offer feel genuine rather than symbolic. She asked him what exactly he expected from her if she accepted the invitation. Alexander smiled slightly and explained that he expected nothing immediately. He simply wanted to talk with her about the way people in her neighborhood experience transportation and daily challenges in the city. Sometimes the best solutions began with honest conversations rather than corporate plans. Sophie looked down at the business card again, then back at the man sitting across from her. 2 nights earlier, she had helped a stranger because it felt like the right thing to do. Now that simple decision had brought the founder of a major company into the middle of her ordinary workday with an offer she had never imagined receiving. And although uncertainty still filled her thoughts, Sophie could not ignore the quiet feeling that the story that began in the rain was only just beginning to unfold. That evening, after the lunch rush had faded and the last customers slowly drifted out of the diner, Sophie Bennett finally had a moment to breathe. The sky outside had turned a soft golden gray as the sun lowered behind the buildings along the Chicago River, casting long shadows across the street. Sophie wiped the final table near the window and placed the chairs neatly beneath it before removing her apron. Her thoughts had been restless ever since the conversation with Alexander Cole earlier that afternoon. The idea that the founder of one of the largest transportation companies in the country had invited her to discuss community programs still felt unreal. She had replayed the conversation again and again while carrying plates and refilling coffee cups. Each time the same question returned to her mind. Why her? She was just a waitress trying to keep up with rent and groceries. She had no degree in business, no experience in large organizations, and no connections to powerful people. Yet Alexander Cole had looked at her as if the small choice she made at the bus stop mattered far more than she believed. Sophie stepped outside the diner and felt the cool evening air brush gently across her face. Traffic moved steadily along the street, while distant train tracks echoed through the city with a low metallic rhythm. She began walking toward the small park near the river where she sometimes went after long shifts. The bench beside the water was empty when she arrived. She sat down and opened her sketchbook slowly, flipping past the drawing of the rainy bus. Stop until she reached a blank page. For a long moment, she simply stared at the empty space. Her pencil hovered above the paper while her thoughts wandered through everything that had happened since the stormy night. She remembered the quiet stranger standing beneath the flickering streetlight. She remembered the way he had looked genuinely surprised when she ordered the ride. And now she knew that the same man had built a company that moved millions of people across cities every day. The contrast between those two moments felt almost impossible to reconcile. At that same hour across town, the top floor of Coal Transit Group headquarters remained brightly lit as Alexander Cole reviewed reports from the day. His office overlooked the river, and the evening lights of Chicago were beginning to glow across the skyline. Yet despite the stacks of documents and data charts on his desk, his thoughts kept returning to the diner conversation. He had spent years studying transportation systems and urban movement patterns, but what interested him now had little to do with logistics or profit margins. Sophie Bennett represented something far more human. A reminder that the purpose of transportation was not only efficiency, but connection. When he had asked her to meet again to discuss community initiatives, he had meant every word. He believed that people who lived within neighborhoods understood challenges that corporate offices often overlooked. However, he also knew that bringing someone like Sophie into his professional world would not be simple. Large companies carried their own politics and skepticism. Some executives would question why their chief executive officer was paying attention to a waitress from small diner. As Alexander looked out over the city lights, he accepted that possibility calmly. Sometimes the right decision required ignoring expectations. Back at the park, Sophie finally lowered her pencil to the page and began drawing again. This time, the image forming on the paper was not the rainy bus stop. Instead, she sketched a wide city street with small figures walking along sidewalks and vehicles moving between buildings. At the center of the scene, she added a simple car stopping beside a person waiting alone at the curb. As the drawing slowly took shape, she realized that transportation in a city was more than roads and vehicles. It was about moments when people helped one another move forward. By the time the first stars appeared faintly above the skyline, Sophie closed the sketchbook and looked out across the dark water of the river. Alexander Cole had asked her to meet again and talk about ideas that might help people in neighborhoods like hers. The offer still felt intimidating, but it also carried a quiet sense of possibility she had not felt in a long time. 2 nights earlier, she had spent her last $25 on a stranger in the rain. Now that simple act had opened a door she had never expected to see. And although Sophie did not yet know what she would say when she met Alexander again, she sensed that the choice waiting ahead might shape far more than her own future. The following day, the city woke beneath a bright autumn sky, sunlight spreading across the glass towers of downtown Chicago and reflecting softly off the river that curved through the heart of the city. Sophie Bennett stood outside the diner for a moment before her shift began, holding a small cup of coffee in both hands while watching commuters hurry along the sidewalk. Normally, mornings felt predictable to her, a steady pattern of work, bills, and quiet routines. Yet today carried a subtle tension she could not ignore. The invitation Alexander Cole had given her the day before continued to echo in her thoughts. He had asked her to meet again and speak honestly about how transportation affected ordinary people in neighborhoods like hers. At first, the idea had seemed impossible. What could a waitress offer to a man who built a company worth billions of dollars? Still, the sincerity in his voice had made it difficult to dismiss the opportunity completely. Inside the diner, the familiar rhythm of breakfast orders quickly filled the room. Sophie moved between tables carrying plates of eggs and toast while customers discussed office meetings and weekend plans. Despite the busy pace, her mind wandered occasionally to the upcoming conversation with Alexander. She wondered what questions he might ask and whether she would sound foolish trying to explain the daily challenges she and her neighbors faced simply getting across the city. Later that afternoon, after the lunch rush had finally settled, Sophie finished wiping down the last table near the window when the small bell above the door chimed again. She looked up instinctively and saw Alexander Cole stepping inside the diner once more. This time his arrival felt less surprising, though her heart still quickened slightly as their eyes met across the room. He greeted her with the same calm smile she remembered from the day before and asked if she had a few minutes after her shift ended. Sophie nodded, explaining that she would finish in about half an hour. Alexander took a seat at the same table near the window and waited patiently while the remaining customers paid their checks and drifted out onto the street. When the diner finally grew quiet, Sophie removed her apron and joined him at the table. The afternoon sunlight stretched through the glass beside them, casting long reflections across the polished wood surface. Alexander began the conversation simply by asking about her daily routine. Sophie described how many people in her neighborhood relied on buses that ran infrequently or trains that stopped operating early in the evening. She explained how workers with late shifts sometimes struggled to reach their jobs or return home safely. Her voice carried no frustration as she spoke, only the calm honesty of someone describing everyday realities. Alexander listened closely, occasionally asking gentle questions that encouraged her to elaborate. As the discussion continued, Sophie found herself speaking more openly than she expected. She explained that transportation problems were not just about distance, but about opportunity. When reliable rides were unavailable, people often lost jobs, missed medical appointments, or declined education programs because traveling across the city felt impossible. Alexander leaned back thoughtfully as he absorbed her perspective. For years, his company had focused on expanding digital services and vehicle networks. But hearing the challenges described from a personal point of view gave the issue a different meaning. Finally, he spoke again and explained the idea that had been forming in his mind since the night at the bus stop. Coal Transit Group was preparing to launch a pilot initiative designed to provide affordable rides in neighborhoods where traditional transportation systems were limited. However, he wanted someone involved who truly understood the daily experiences of the communities the program would serve. Alexander looked directly at Sophie as he made the proposal. He asked if she would consider working with his team as a community advisor during the early stages of the project. Sophie felt a quiet shock ripple through her thoughts. She had expected a conversation, or perhaps a brief exchange of ideas. Instead, she was being invited to participate in shaping a program that might influence transportation across several neighborhoods in Chicago. She hesitated before answering, reminding him again that she had no formal training in transportation planning or corporate management. Alexander responded with a calm confidence that made his words feel genuine rather than persuasive. The company already had engineers and analysts, he explained. What they needed was insight from someone who understood the people their systems were meant to serve. As Sophie looked out through the diner window at the city street beyond, she realized the moment represented a crossroads she had never imagined encountering. The simple act of helping a stranger in the rain had led to a conversation that might allow her voice to influence decisions affecting thousands of people. And although uncertainty still lingered in her thoughts, Sophie Bennett began to understand that the opportunity before her might be far more meaningful than she ever expected. The following morning dawned bright and clear over Chicago, the city streets glistening from the previous night rain and sunlight reflecting off the glass towers along the river. Sophie Bennett arrived at the diner earlier than usual, carrying her sketchbook in one hand and a small insulated cup of coffee in the other. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves from the small park nearby, and the hum of morning traffic provided a familiar backdrop to her thoughts. Her mind lingered on the conversation with Alexander Cole the day before, turning over the invitation he had extended for her to work as a community advisor on his transportation project. She felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension, unsure how a simple waitress could fit into a program designed by one of the most successful executives in the country. Inside the diner, Sophie tied on her apron and moved quickly through the familiar routine, pouring coffee, delivering breakfast plates, and greeting early customers with the calm, practiced smile she had developed over years of work. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing slightly heavier today, knowing that after her shift, she would be meeting Alexander again to discuss the program in more detail. She paused briefly by the window, glancing at the river and imagining the busy streets filled with people who relied on public transportation every day, thinking about how her voice could influence decisions that might help many of them. Across town, Alexander Cole prepared for his visit to the diner. His office had been bustling with early morning meetings, but his focus was now entirely on the encounter ahead. He had reviewed notes, outlined talking points, and thought carefully about how to approach the conversation with Sophie, wanting to ensure that she felt respected and that her perspective was genuinely valued. When he arrived at the diner a short time later, he parked his car discreetly a few blocks away and walked the remaining distance, dressed in simple, unassuming clothes that would allow him to blend in while still carrying the quiet confidence of his position. The small bell above the entrance chimed as he stepped inside, and Sophie looked up instinctively, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of recognition and cautious curiosity. After exchanging greetings, they moved to the small table near the window, and Alexander began the discussion by asking Sophie to share her thoughts on transportation challenges she had observed in her neighborhood. Sophie spoke candidly, describing the difficulties faced by people who worked late shifts, had to travel to multiple locations for school or appointments, or relied on buses that ran infrequently and trains that stopped operating before evening. She explained how even small delays or gaps in service could affect jobs, medical care, and daily life. Alexander listened intently, nodding occasionally and asking thoughtful questions to understand the nuances of her experiences. As the conversation continued, Sophie found herself speaking more freely than she had anticipated. She mentioned the frustrations of waiting in cold weather, the stress of juggling schedules when rides were unreliable, and the challenges faced by families who had limited transportation options. Alexander absorbed every detail, taking mental notes and occasionally jotting ideas on a small notepad he kept beside him. He explained that Coal Transit Group was planning a pilot initiative to improve access to transportation in underserved neighborhoods, but he wanted guidance from someone who truly understood the daily realities faced by residents. His request was simple. She could provide insight, feedback, and suggestions, helping shape the program so that it met real needs rather than just theoretical goals. Sophie hesitated at first, unsure whether her perspective would be taken seriously, but Alexander reassured her that he valued honesty over expertise and that lived experience often provided the clearest understanding of community needs. She finally nodded, agreeing to participate in the early stages of the initiative, realizing that a choice made out of simple kindness 2 nights earlier had now opened a door to an opportunity she never imagined. As they continued to talk, the light from the late morning sun shifted across the diner, highlighting the faint steam rising from the coffee cups and casting a gentle glow over the table between them. Sophie felt a quiet sense of purpose beginning to settle within her, a feeling that the small decisions she made could have far-reaching impact. Alexander, for his part, felt a similar anticipation, recognizing that the young woman sitting before him had a perspective that could change the way his company approached transportation in the city. And as they discussed ideas, plans, and possibilities, both understood that this meeting marked the beginning of a collaboration that would extend far beyond the walls of the diner, grounded in trust, insight, and the unexpected power of a single act of kindness. Weeks passed as Sophie Bennett continued her involvement with the Community Transportation Initiative, meeting with Alexander Cole regularly to discuss ideas, review feedback from neighborhood residents, and plan improvements to the pilot program. Each session brought new insights and challenges, from understanding the daily obstacles faced by families who relied on buses and trains to designing schedules that could accommodate late-night workers and students. Sophie often found herself walking through the neighborhoods, observing streets, intersections, and bus stops, taking notes in her worn sketchbook, and talking with residents about their experiences. Alexander accompanied her on several occasions, but more often he observed quietly, letting her lead the conversations while taking mental notes for strategic planning. One afternoon, as they reviewed a map of transportation routes at a small cafe near the river, Alexander pulled out the receipt from the rainy night 2 weeks prior, still carefully folded in his wallet. He reminded Sophie that it was the spark for everything that had followed. She smiled, acknowledging that a simple act of helping someone in need had unexpectedly grown into an initiative that might improve thousands of lives. Over time, the pilot program began to take shape, incorporating feedback from local workers, families, and students, with Alexander and Sophie coordinating closely with drivers, schedulers, and community leaders to implement small but meaningful changes. The initiative focused on extending service hours, ensuring safer pickup locations, and providing more reliable transportation for those with urgent medical appointments or late-night shifts. Through it all, Sophie discovered a sense of purpose that went far beyond her previous work at the diner, feeling that her voice and experience truly mattered. Alexander, on the other hand, began to see the city from a perspective he had long overlooked. Sitting in boardrooms and reviewing reports had given him a strategic view. But walking the streets with Sophie, speaking directly with residents, and understanding the human impact of each decision offered a perspective that could not be measured in data charts. One evening, after a long day of meetings and community visits, Alexander invited Sophie to a small reception in the company's conference room where they could present the progress of the pilot program to a few senior managers. The room was filled with people accustomed to numbers, graphs, and projections, yet Sophie's insights from lived experiences captivated their attention. She described the daily routines, the obstacles, and the small victories that the initiative had already produced. The executives listened intently, occasionally asking questions, but the authenticity in Sophie's words resonated more than any statistic ever could. After the presentation, Alexander pulled Sophie aside and handed her a small framed item. Inside was the digital receipt from the rainy night, neatly mounted with a photograph of the bus stop where they had first met. He explained that the receipt was a symbol, a reminder of how small acts of kindness could grow into meaningful change. Sophie felt a mixture of surprise and warmth, realizing that what had started as a simple gesture had grown into a shared vision between them. The experience deepened her respect and trust in Alexander, not only as a leader, but as someone who valued her perspective and humanity above titles and power. As they walked back toward the streets outside, Sophie looked up at the city skyline bathed in the golden glow of evening light. Every decision they made together. Months later, the pilot program launched fully across several neighborhoods in Chicago, and Sophie Bennett found herself walking through streets she had long known with a sense of purpose and anticipation that had been absent from her daily life for years. Each morning she reviewed schedules, spoke with drivers, and checked in with families who relied on the program, making small adjustments based on real feedback and direct observation. The program's expansion brought tangible improvements. Late-night workers reached their jobs on time, students arrived at schools without stress, and elderly residents were able to attend medical appointments reliably. Alexander Cole remained involved, visiting the neighborhoods regularly, listening to reports, and observing the changes firsthand. Despite the busy schedule of a chief executive officer, he made time to accompany Sophie on several trips, ensuring that her insight guided the initiative effectively. One crisp autumn evening, the program celebrated its official completion at a small gathering in a local community center. Residents, drivers, and city officials gathered to acknowledge the positive impact and the innovative approach that had brought the project to life, and the understanding that genuine acts of humanity could shape the world in ways money and influence alone could not. As the evening light faded and the city lights began to twinkle across the Chicago skyline, Alexander suggested they take a short walk along the river. They stepped outside together, the crisp air carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and the gentle hum of the city at dusk. Walking side by side, Sophie felt a sense of completion and clarity, knowing that the journey that began with a simple act of kindness had led to a meaningful, lasting impact. Alexander paused at the edge of a small bridge, turning toward her with a thoughtful expression. He spoke quietly, asking if she would continue working with him not only to support the program, but also to explore other ways they could make a difference together. Sophie smiled, recognizing that the invitation was as much personal as it was professional. She nodded, accepting not just the opportunity to help others, but also the unexpected bond that had formed between them. In that quiet moment, overlooking the river with the city lights reflecting in the water, both understood that their story had come full circle. A ride given freely in the rain had grown into a partnership of purpose, respect, and trust, and perhaps even the beginning of something far deeper. As they continued walking, Sophie glanced at Alexander with a quiet certainty that the chance encounter had forever changed both of their lives, and that the future they would build together would be shaped by kindness, understanding, and the small decisions that truly mattered.